It's my pleasure to introduce actually two colleagues. Jake's a colleague from history at Lawrence, and Kate Moody, his partner, is a librarian at Ripon, who's also a colleague of mine and Patty's. So hope you come and meet them after the talk. They're wonderful people, and I'm sure they'd love to meet you. So Jake is an associate professor of history at Lawrence University in Wisconsin. Lawrence has a center in London, the Lawrence London Center, which is also a member of the Association of American Study Abroad programs, which Harlaxton is involved in, and which we chaired up until very recently. Ian Welch was our vice principal, was chair of that group until last year. Jake got his BA at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in English, and later his MA and PhD in history from Penn State University. There's a gap of time between those things, as I understand it, and you probably forgot that you gave an interview in 2007 where you talked about that gap in time. So students, Google's an amazing thing. This is irresponsible of me, but I'm going to tell you a few things I found on Google about Jake. So he describes that gap as the long road of turning into my father. Do you remember this? Yeah. Jake is the son of a novelist named Frederick, published several novels, several short stories. If you open a Best American Short Stories, you will find stories by Frederick in it. But also during this time, Jake was an ambulance worker in Boston. He was a staff writer for a newspaper, earning $12 a week. That's really impressive, $12 a week. He worked in a factory making cake frosting tube tips. Worked in a sporting goods store, a scuba repair shop, taught kayaking, and delivered pizzas. So that's what he did after he got his major in English. So go English majors. Hey, I'm a French medieval literature major, so I can say that. He was also a forest fire, which is kind of one of the cool things related to this particular talk, and fought fires in Mexico. And this is your quote: because there was so much smoke coming into Texas that the Texans complained to the US government. This is why you went down to fight fires in Mexico. So, jumped out of a lot of helicopters, fought a lot of fires, going to talk to us tonight about fires. Jake is not an English historian, but he's obviously connecting his interest in Mexican history with this time that he's spending in England teaching at the London Center. His most recent book is about 18th century Mexico. It's coming out from, it's an English press, isn't it? Sussex Academic Press, in their Latin American Studies series. It's called Riot: Tobacco, Reform, and Violence in 18th Century Papantia, Mexico. But tonight he's going to talk to us about the Great Fire of London and the history of everything afterwards. So please help me welcoming Jake.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you, Harlaxton, for hosting me. Thank you to all of you coming out tonight. First of all, I have to apologize for these obviously terrible accommodations we have to endure. It's not quite to the standard of my usual classroom, but we'll try to endure it if we can. So yes, this talk is called The Great Fire of London and the History of Everywhere Else, and so I figure I should begin by explaining the name. The first thing I want to point out is that this paper is really a product of ongoing research, and so you know ongoing research is an academic's way of saying you really can't hold me too closely to the conclusions I'm going to draw. But what I've been looking into is fire protection in 18th century cities. And what I found is that fire is, of course, a terrible threat to any city, and it is essential to defend against it to protect the populace and the financial success of any city. But what I've also found is that in the 17th and 18th centuries, there seems to be something else at play as well. Fire protection became a measure of what it meant for a modern city to be modern. So I will explain, of course, what you've heard. I am a Mexican historian, so how have I come to this topic at all? Well, the first reason I came to this topic is because fire is really, really neat. And if you don't think it's great fun, I don't know how you guys entertain yourselves. But the other reason is that a number of years ago, I was studying at the Lilly Library at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, Indiana. And I bumped into a 90-page document, a shout out for Bloomington there, a 90-page document which was this huge proposal for new laws for fire protection for Mexico City, and it was produced in 1783. And this was a very comprehensive set of laws that required a lot of changes and a lot of expense for the population and for the city itself in Mexico City. But since Mexico City never had a truly massive citywide fire, I wanted to know why such a proposal existed at all. And when I looked at the proposal, what I found is throughout the entire document, it kept looking back to European cities to see what they were doing and trying to emulate what European cities were doing in response to the threat of fire. And what I found is that in all of those proposals for new laws in different cities, all of them looked back to London and the Great Fire of 1666. So that is why this talk really begins here. London in 1666 was not, in the summer of 1666, was not really a terrific place. I have a map here of, let's just assume this is the original Roman name for the town, Ndon. Hopefully we're not going to lose too many important words here. In 1560, after it had been developing for quite some time, but by the summer of 1666, one could be forgiven for thinking that London could maybe have no better break than a major catastrophic fire. And let me explain. For more than a millennium and a half, the city had been built into a warren of tight streets with overhanging wooden structures. It had developed as an organic growth, which is to say the roads were laid out not according to any kind of regular pattern, but rather where the wheel ruts of carts had cut through the landscape, or where people had beaten paths by walking around. Businesses went up wherever that struck the minds of individuals to put them up. And so houses sat cheek by jowl with dye shops, with bakeries, with tanneries, which, if I have time later, I will describe to you why those are particularly foul places to live next to. Also, beginning in the early 1500s, London began to experience an enormous period of growth. Over the course of the 1500s and into the 1600s, London became a center for trade in England, and then for wider Europe, and then even beyond that. In 1520, there were 50 to 60,000 people estimated to live in London, and historical figures of population can be very, very dicey, but we're going to go with 50 to 60,000 because I'm on this side of the podium and I say so. So, in 1600, there were 200,000 people, and by 1650, there were 400,000 people. The narrow streets in this city grew narrower as it became more and more choked up with people, and the streets became even tighter than they were beforehand. As buildings grew taller, they actually stepped out with upper stories a little wider than the stories below them. In fact, famously, it is said that in some of the narrower alleyways, someone could lean out the upstairs window of one house and shake hands with somebody in the upstairs house of another, of the house across the street. Now, you'll notice in these pictures that these are images from Southampton and maybe from World of Warcraft. This is actually a CGI image created by a marvelous, in a marvelous short video by Pudding Lane Productions, which tries to demonstrate what the city was like at the time, and I think it does a really nice job of that. Of course, the reason I have to show you these is because the examples in London were primarily incinerated, so we have to look for pictures from somewhere else. As the city got more and more crowded, the infrastructure didn't develop to keep up with that increasing population. It was a nasty place with no sewage system, Think about that for a moment. With no municipal trash disposal, it stank. The streets were filled with the waste of pigs and horses and people. The names of some of the streets do a marvelous job of conveying what some of the worst bits of the city would have been like at the time. This fire that we're going to talk about in a moment began on Pudding Lane, which for the Americans in the audience might conjure up a nice sweet notion, but in fact, Pudding Lane was named for its tradition as the place where animals were gutted, and the pudding, which is to say intestines and innards, were then left to slide their way towards the Thames. That is just one of hundreds of repellent businesses and smells that would have been poisoning the air of that twisted and labyrinthine city. And just to make sure that you have the complete picture here, smallpox, tuberculosis, and syphilis were also traveling the streets as freely as the citizenry were. So for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, think flea bottom, and you should have a pretty accurate idea. It also had a pretty bad history at the time. The middle of the 17th century was not particularly kind to London. Civil War broke out in 1642. In 1649, the king, Charles I, was beheaded. Then we had a decade of puritanical rule, which included, among other things, no theaters at all. The crown was only restored in 1660 when Charles II came to the throne, and then by 1664, England was at war with the Dutch. Oh, and in 1665, London experienced the last great outbreak of the bubonic plague, killing an estimated 100,000 people. So you saw that the numbers went up to 400,000 in 1650. They kind of dropped down a little bit before the big fire. But London was not without its charms. London was a center of wealth and commerce and politics, and that's why so many people were going to it. It was a place where an enormous amount of money was getting made. And it had new institutions, like coffee houses, which opened for the first time in the 1660s. And it had the Royal Exchange. And the dichotomy in the city is striking. And historian James Leeser, I think, described it absolutely fantastically when he described London as a city of contrasts, hunger and prodigality, filth and luxury, a boudoir next to a dunghill. And the same historian pointed out that many, many Londoners at this point felt like the only way that London could be set right was to completely start over. And a lot of Londoners felt this way, and boy were they in luck, because on the late night of September the 1st into the early morning of September the 2nd, 1666, the wrecking ball that was going to wipe London off the map began its swing into the city. So here is the time for the exciting story of the burning of London, which I'm not going to tell you. But you're already in the room, you can't leave. The reason I'm not going to tell you is that so many historians have told the tale of the fire that began in Thomas Farriner's bakery. They've done it very, very well, and that's not really the point I want to get across tonight. So really what I'll do is just give you a couple of numbers to give an idea of what the city experienced. Over the course of 4 days, more than 13,200 houses were burned, 87 of 109 parish churches were burned, 50 guild halls were destroyed, and of course, most famously, St. Paul's Cathedral was consumed in the fire. Less than a dozen people are actually recorded as having died in this fire, but those were the important people worth recording. Recent studies have, a variety of recent scholarship has pretty conclusively shown that hundreds, if not thousands, of London's nameless died in this fire as well. Now, there are images from the time after the fire to help us envision what this might have been like. This map demonstrates all the white area is what was burned. And this is the wall that surrounds the city. Here's an image that is also depicting what remained of the city after the disaster. We can see that 370 odd acres were burned, most of the city inside the walls. But it's hard, I think, to really get a grasp on what this means, to envision the kind of scale of destruction that had taken place. And the numbers don't really easily communicate that. In the wake of a great fire, one can see too far. You look across hundreds of yards of skeletal remains of timber frames. There are light traces of smoke dancing where there used to be streets and buildings and churches. You can see across areas that until just days ago were packed with hundreds of thousands of tons of timber, of plaster, paint, roofs, windows, signs, piled up 3 and 4 and 5 stories deep. And so I think later photographs can kind of help us envision what this was like. Here we have an image of a street in Chicago both before and after the fire. The space is simply strange. It's so open. San Francisco, we see the same kind of thing. It looks like photographs at the end of the Second World War. And so what we had in London was very much like this, a genuinely clean slate. The place had been, the central part of the city had been wiped off the map. And so this was an opportunity to create a better, newer London. And while the fire is still cooling, while there is still smoke pouring out of basements, a number of people try to take up this opportunity to build a brand new London, to start again, to create something that is modern. Modern like the 16th century ought to be modern. Within a week, King Charles II begins issuing new rules of construction after the fire. London streets are supposed to be widened so that fire can't leap from block to block as it did in the Great Fire. Lanes and alleys are supposed to be avoided altogether. They're not even supposed to rebuild the things if they can avoid it. All rebuilding that does take place has to be done in brick or in stone. They finally put in some zoning. Dangerous and particularly stinky businesses are supposed to be moved away from places where there's housing. So dyers, brewers, and sugar bakers are no longer allowed to build their shops along the principal streets. John Evelyn goes a little farther. He's a member of the Privy Council, and he suggests that this is also a good time to maybe take the fishmongers and the butchers and the candle makers, all of whom have particularly foul-smelling businesses, and move them outside the city altogether. And with all these rules about rebuilding, just for good measure, nobody's supposed to rebuild anything at all. So the rules that come out about a week after the fire say all these things that you cannot do while rebuilding, and don't rebuild anything anyway, because they need to conduct a major survey of the city before they can start a new project. And this survey of the city is going to turn out to take much, much too long to be feasible. And so planners, though, start designing new ideas for the city. And I'm sorry, the slide is cut off. Resurgam, I shall rise again. This is from the pediment on the front of St. Paul's Cathedral and really does symbolize this city as, thank you, as a phoenix rising again from the ashes. And planners start to put together new ideas, not just to protect against fire, but also with some nice aesthetics in mind. On September 11th, just 6 days after the major expansion of the fire stopped, Christopher Wren, one of London's most successful architects and one of history's most famous architects, submits a plan to the city. His plan divides the city into separate zones in which these parts of the city are actually supposed to be relatively autonomous in terms of their emergency responses. He borrows from ancient Rome, taking this octagonal style plaza here on the end. And he goes for long sight lines so that you can see great distances across the city, which later planners point out might not have been feasible given the terrain of the city. But it's supposed to be this kind of this grand modern European city with huge thoroughfares. 2 days after him, John Evelyn submits his own plan for an entirely new London, which has very similar elements. What he did is he took a grid pattern and laid that same octagon on top of the western side of the pattern and added a kite image to the eastern side. Deviating from Wren, what he does is he puts major municipal buildings at these intersections. So instead of long views of the city, he wanted people to have direct views of symbols of city and state power. Others went for more practical, workability. Robert Hooke of the Royal Society steered away from those radiating lines in favor of blocks, and he put in place a rectangular grid with 4 major squares for markets and fountains. He also reduced the number of churches that were going to be rebuilt in this city to just 15 from the 87 that were destroyed. It turns out that every plan, including the one that finally went into place, reduced the number of churches significantly. Valentine Knight puts what looks like a very simple plan into place. He's submitting it just as fast as everybody else is. But his point here is to emphasize regularly sized blocks for the city, with wide streets running east and west and north and south, specifically to break up the possibility of fire spread. He also suggested, we lost this part of the image, but if you can see just in the corner here, he suggested that all these blocks be arcaded down at the sidewalk level so you could marry commerce with the housing, another notion that's particularly keen to people who want to see a modern city develop. He also added a canal that would facilitate transport all around the city, connecting to the Fleet River. And Richard Newcourt, another planner, put forth this, what looks fairly simple, but a very uniform plan that incorporates 4 major public squares. But the execution of this doesn't really take place. Any of you who have been to London, how many people in the room have been to London? How many people have gotten lost in London? Okay, so you can see that these things didn't actually happen for the most part. For a variety of reasons, London is really overwhelmed by inertia in some ways, and with few exceptions, London grows back in the design that it had before the fire. And there are a few reasons for this. One is speed. City planners and the king are frightened that if people don't come back soon enough, then they'll relocate their homes and their businesses elsewhere permanently, and London will cease to be the city it's been developing into for the last 150 years. Another important point is that London's got very strong private property laws, and it is very hard to alienate that property from people. And there are complex, ancient, noble ownership patterns in the city which are very hard to sort out. There aren't even enough surveyors to go around to figure out who used to own what, when really what you have as evidence is just a change in the color of the ash on the ground, or maybe some old basement pits. Another important point is that the monarchy is not particularly strong at this point either. Charles has been in office for 5 years, and the last guy to hold the office had his head lopped off. He is working with a fairly strong, or relatively strong, parliament, and so he doesn't really have the opportunity to dictatorially say, we're going to choose this plan, we're going to rebuild the city to look like I think it should. And so what happens with London is that these narrow, tight, tangled roads are eventually replaced with narrow, tight, tangled roads. But they don't completely disregard the history of the fire by any means. The Crown and Parliament did ultimately pass quite a number of new laws governing future fire safety for the city. There was an act in late 1666, very quickly put into place, an act for the rebuilding of the City of London, and then soon after, in 1670, another act for the rebuilding of the City of London. These acts created 4 standardized types of housing based on the sizes of the streets that they fronted. These acts actually limited ceiling heights for every different type of house. They required that there were fireproof walls between different structures. Structures were supposed to now be made out of stone and brick, being, quote, durable, but also more safe against future perils of fire. So they're very consciously trying to make sure this doesn't happen twice. They also move noisome and perilous trades, banned from being built on the high streets, as I mentioned before. They also banned the use of wooden or flammable projections sticking out of the front of buildings. So if I go back, I think I haven't got an image of a window open up, but this is actually a time when they ban having anything that could catch fire or catch embers from sticking out open, and so Sash windows become popular in the wake of the London fire because those are windows you can open up without either taking up space inside the house or opening them up as projections that could potentially cause fires. And so no longer would it be possible to see signs like these from London all over the city of London. Obviously, laws evolve over time, and they've been creeping back out of the sides of buildings. London's fire protection laws are quite strong now, and we don't quite have to worry about it the same way. Additional fire laws will get added over the course of coming decades, but overall, these are new policies for the old city and not a new model for a city altogether. Though the grand designs of Wren, Evelyn, Hook, and others never really do turn into reality, they are remembered and they will have an effect along with these new fire laws elsewhere across Europe and even across the Atlantic Ocean. So let's look at other places influenced by the Great Fire of London and the reaction to it. In 1683, when William Penn set out to design the city of Philadelphia, which was a new city at the time, he had a blank slate on which he could work. He did so with a very keen awareness of the disaster that struck London 17 years earlier. He built that city without those policies in mind. He borrowed directly from Richard Newcourt's plan as he designed that city. He also borrowed from the Act for the Rebuilding of London. He insisted that only fire-resistant materials be used in the creation of Philadelphia buildings. He also added something new to it, which was that he suggested that all buildings be built in the center of lots so that you don't have a contiguous fuel supply stretching across the city. In 1697, Russia's Peter the Great made a grand tour of Western Europe, including London. And when he went back to Russia, he sought to modernize its cities in an echo of the Enlightenment designs that he saw out to the west. And no small part of that was a growing understanding in Western Europe, and particularly in London, that orderly policing and calculated urban planning to protect against fires was one of the marks of what made a city modern. And if London wasn't completely rebuilt, it did gain new laws as a result of the fires. Moscow, of course, had a marvelous tradition of fires. It had a terrible fire in 1571, another in 1611, another in 1628, another in 1648. It was basically not on fire a small amount of the time. And this helped Peter the Great impart new laws into Moscow so he could put fire protection plans into the city. In 1701, he ordered that all houses that burned down had to be replaced with houses built of stone rather than wood. Then in 1704, several years after this fire here, which is the Kremlin on fire, he ordered that all buildings in the area of the Kremlin be replaced with, if they are made of wood, they have to be torn down and rebuilt in stone, whether they've caught fire or not. This kind of thing is expensive, and it's difficult, and it takes a powerful authority to be able to do it. And Peter was a very powerful authority. But though Moscow had a lot of fires and it had powerful Peter there, it also had a very long tradition of being a labyrinthine city. It didn't have a clean slate that he could work with. In fact, he wasn't able to really put forth all of his proposals until he founded himself a new city in 1703 when he built St. Petersburg. This was where he laid out plans that he had learned in the West and their responses to urban fires. In 1711, he also went further. He made firefighting the responsibility of the state. He ordered the creation of fire departments and military participation in firefighting. These were inspired by laws coming from, among other places, Amsterdam and elsewhere. Amsterdam has a great firefighting tradition, but also quite clearly from London as well. Then, in 1755, Lisbon experienced what historians usually refer to as, quote, the worst day ever. On the morning of November the 1st, 1755, an earthquake with a magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0 struck the city. This caused a tsunami. In fact, it caused 3 tsunamis. Those were followed by 5 days of cataclysmic fires. The scale of the disaster was absolutely total. 30,000 people died. The king, reportedly casting about for some idea how to respond, turned to one of his advisors, the Count de Orais. Does anybody speak Portuguese? Then that's the correct way to pronounce it. He would later become the Marquis de Pombal, whose name I will use, obviously, because it's easier to say. Pombal responded, "What we do is we bury the dead and we feed the living." That sanguine response to total catastrophe led the king to give Pombal complete authority over the reconstruction of the city. Now, the Marquis de Pombal had been the ambassador to London in 1738, and while he was there, he learned a great deal about the fire laws that were in place in London. He also learned of the plans that were offered but didn't go into place in London. He also was given tremendous individual authority to decide the future of the city. He used principles that were employed in London to create, here's a picture of the city beforehand, by the way. This is a picture of it afterwards, and if you look really closely, you can see the lines of the old streets underneath the new streets. He opted for using standardized buildings. He chose to use a grid like those that had been suggested for London. He also decides to go for zoning and does so in a particularly effective way. He moves away noxious trades such as animal rendering, which stinks, and baking, which is actually enormously dangerous. It requires fires going all the time. He has all the bakers move to a particular part of the city that is actually enclosed in a reputedly fireproof wall. One of the things that greatly differed, though, for the Marquis de Pombal was he had a total disregard for property rights. He was given the authority to make all the decisions himself. He particularly ignored the desires of the churches. He had a plan that was for a modern, orderly city, one that was actually shaped particularly to aid in capitalism. The city is designed to access the port and facilitate markets. Portugal at this time had been embracing the idea of enlightened despotism, which is when the state rules in the favor of the people, but does so with despotic authority. So then we come to Mexico City. This is the odd one out for me. Mexico City lacks the kind of fire tradition or recent disaster that I have mentioned elsewhere. Where other cities had lots of fires to help leaders pave the way for new fire laws, Mexico City didn't. I mean, it had fires. Everybody's got fires. No self-respecting city doesn't have the occasional good fire, but nothing on the scale of what I was talking about before. But instead, what it had was Charles III, who was the King of Spain, who came into power in the middle of the 1700s, and began a process of expanding absolutist control of the Spanish crown. The crown intended to insinuate its authority much more thoroughly into the lives of all of its subjects, a process that collectively became known as the Bourbon Reforms. And city fathers in Mexico City recognized this, and they wrote their proposal to the king to try to embrace the fact that he wanted to see this expanded power. The document I alluded to before, written in 1783, opens with a clear declaration that a modern city is the kind of city that has to be protected from fire. And I want to read you a quotation from this. It's a little bit long, but please forgive me. Among the multitudes of dangers that threaten our cities and their inhabitants, none is more imminent, more fatal, more ruinous than that of fire in the houses and buildings. The voraciousness of fire can destroy in a few hours a street, a neighborhood, a quarter, an entire city, its inhabitants. The worst of them can bring forth a lasting poverty, precisely what London was afraid of. perishing among the ruins of the inheritance of their forebears, the flow of their wealth, and the tools of their industry. This scourge that destroys the fortunes of the city dwellers and throws open the doors of desperation should be the object of the major part of the government and the ministers of police of every civilized city. The leaders of Mexico City are using this language to clearly say to the king, if you want to have modern cities in your realm, modern cities are fire-protected cities. The document also looked to ancient Rome to justify its new laws, but it also consciously and carefully looked towards European cities, London being a particular example. The authors of the document actually wistfully wrote at one point, in England, there are home fire and security companies, and they have admirable methods to prevent fires. And they come to danger with help just as fast as needed. Mexico City is trying to become a European city. And the way to do that is to have ordered and organized authority over the element of fire. And they put forward really highly detailed legislation. They have new construction laws, thatched roofs are banned, something that was actually banned in 1212 in the City of London, but people kind of continued with it anyway. Wooden buildings on corners were to be knocked down and then rebuilt out of stone. The city was to be divided into separate police and fire districts. Businesses that were dependent on ovens had to be moved outside of the central city. They borrowed another tactic from London, which was to pre-position firefighting equipment all over the city. So there were ladders and buckets and pumps to be ready in case of disaster. And they ascribed responsibilities to every group in the city, the plumbers, the builders, the architects, the mendicant friars, all had particular responsibilities that they were supposed to engage in if an emergency broke out. And all of them had to swear oath after oath after oath. The language of this document and the lack of real catastrophes to justify it demonstrates to me that the planners in Mexico City were embracing this reformist plan in Spain. Spain wants to be an absolutist power. The Spanish crown wants incredible new dominion in its areas. And so this leads me to two conclusions. One is my kind of confident conclusion. One is my assertive, but not as much so as the first one, conclusion. Mexico is the most interesting case because it is strange. It has no big fires, but it does manage to pass big fire laws. And these are laws that are really intrusive into the lives of the residents in the city. It breaks the pattern where London had a really big fire and it needed a catastrophic fire to initiate its new plans. It still couldn't go far enough to impart any of the various schemes for rebuilding the whole city that we saw. Mexico, on the other hand, manages to change its laws without any kind of clean slate to work from. Another thing that's different, or there are a couple of things that I think are going on here, one of which is that Mexico doesn't observe the same kind of property rights that London does, where London has generations and generations of property traditions set down over centuries. Mexico City is actually a very new city. It's not founded on the old site of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan until the 1500s, when London is already more than 1,000 years old. Also, if you look at the picture, Mexico is really relatively new and relatively straight, which is a consequence of the fact that it's built on the old Aztec city. But what's more important is that Spain was undergoing massive political reform, and Charles III was trying to remake his empire into something that he could control very intrusively, very thoroughly, in an absolutist way. He wanted his power infused into every part of the empire, all the way down to the walls of the buildings that his subjects lived in. To be honest, Mexico City didn't need these fire laws. In fact, Mexico City will not have a professional fire department until the beginning of the 20th century because it's not deemed necessary. Leaders in Mexico liked those laws because, yes, they made the city safer, this is true, but it also made the city seem like a modern European capital. The crown liked it because it made him seem like a more authoritative leader. So here's my sort of more speculative claim, that I think strong fire laws, at least in the early modern era, are really the dominion of very powerful centralized states. In a place like Lisbon, it was only possible to really rebuild the city as a totally new environment because the Marquis de Pombal was essentially given dictatorial authority over the city. In Mexico, the laws that did get put into place were done because the king wants more power. London is, of course, very different. In London, where property laws were strong and old, where the monarchy was, by some estimations, relatively young, being back in office for only 5 years and being forced to share power with Parliament, it didn't have the singular authority to build a new plan. Charles II really liked the idea of Wren and the ideas of Evelyn and the others, but he didn't have that kind of singular authority, even with a completely wiped clean slate. But London, of course, did rise again anew, and it did so with breathtaking speed. This map is from 1676, and you can see that in just about a decade after the fire, most of the city is built back in, and it's built in to look a lot like it used to. It does have some new laws that reduce the risk of fires, but it's built in the same way that it was built the first time, in the form of 1,000 separate building projects as tenants returned to their leases, as property owners defended the boundaries of their lands, as London was reborn, as it has been the first time, as an organic objective of a series of organic personal objectives of its many, many thousands of residents. And it wasn't the foreordained scheme of Wren or Evelyn or even the king himself. And so I'd like to close by badly paraphrasing John Steinbeck, in that the best laid plans of mice and men often fall to the wayside, or perhaps they just wind up on the architectural benches of people working in places like Philadelphia, St. Petersburg, Lisbon, or perhaps Mexico City. So thank you very much. I appreciate you all taking the time. And I think we're through. Just want to make sure I didn't run so terribly long.
Jake's happy to take some questions if you have them.
I was just wondering, given what was happening in Mexico City and how you relate that to the wider political objectives going on in Spain, whether there was any plans to remodel, say, Madrid or Seville or anything actually in the Iberian Peninsula?
There were a number of new laws being proposed for Madrid. I haven't seen anything nearly as extensive as what comes out of Mexico City. I think there's two things going on here. One is what's happening in Mexico is that the city fathers feel a greater need to elevate themselves to be on equivalent status with European capital cities. In some ways, there's very much this kind of colonial insecurity. Mexico City is now, well, it has been a very powerful city for a while for the colonies, but by the 1700s, it sees itself as able to be viewed on par with old world cities, and it wants to see this done again. So I don't think we see as much impetus for change. So to a degree, this is really more of a Mexico City-born idea. There are new laws being put in place in major cities in Spain, which I think is following on with the notion that there is an enormous development in awareness of fire prevention methods and firefighting technologies. These 100 years, actually, between the Great Fire and the 1700s see some really significant advances in firefighting, including the invention of the fire hose, which allows you for the first time to get away from the source of water and relatively near the fire, if that addresses the question. Yes?
Do you know anything about Edinburgh? I was thinking
No.
Edinburgh is sort of an
example which might be interesting. I think it confirms some aspects of what you're talking about,
Mhm.
and there are probably some different elements there. You've got this combination of the old city that stays
Mhm.
there, and then they build on the new city. And the old city looks, in many ways, very much like London, with its tiny streets and original buildings. And then the new city is brick pattern and so on. And clearly the new city as well is bound up very much with the new Hanoverian dynasty. It's on George Street and Princess
Sure.
Street and all that sort of thing. I don't know anything about fire regulations and that sort of thing, but I wonder if there might be an interesting comparison between the capital of England and the capital of Scotland and how they play out. By that stage, of course, I assume there are different sorts of Enlightenment principles which are coming into play and shaping town planning and those sorts of things. I'm not sure that's a question.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems a worthwhile line of inquiry because, you know, the capital cities, major cities are demonstrations in many ways of the power of monarchies and other states. They're largely monarchies at this point. So I would think that one would be able to find similar processes going on. And you know, for the purposes of the paper here, I didn't make much of a point of policing, but policing is, of course, enormously important in this process of modernizing, and policing and fire are actually not very separated from one another. Those are kind of considered part and parcel of the same thing. So I would assume that these policing policies would be influential in, you know, as Hanoverian redesigns are put into place.
You mentioned, I think, that all of the designs proposed for rebuilding of London included far fewer churches than the original there. Is that as a consequence of the ungodliness of the designers, or is it a reflection of what was going on at the time, of course, between Catholic and Protestant, this sort of flip-flopping?
My understanding is that stage is that though both of those points could certainly have been very influential, what I've seen thus far leads to an economic answer in that there are so many churches that have been around for so long. Not all of them are necessarily even serving a very substantial population. And so I think there's an inspiration in the idea of efficiency, or perhaps a justification in the idea of efficiency. But given the religious tensions at the time, the notion that you could reduce these would, I think, be very advantageous for state power wielders. But my understanding at this point, I can speak to the economic and efficiency side, and that certainly seems to be a strong influence. Did that successfully skirt the question?
Yeah, no, because of course the Paul was the first to do anything. It's the wonder whether there was a sort of clearing out of what were obviously Catholic churches.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps, I don't know whether the few churches that were proposed, I have no idea, were larger perhaps, and were to be a little bit more Anglican, more sober model than the previous.
Mm-hmm. Well, not being much of an expert on the architecture of churches, I can say this. I took a tour of the City of London, and I think actually I have the basic thesis of church architecture in London, which I think it goes something like this. This was a really tremendous thing. It burned in 1666. Then Christopher Wren rebuilt it. And either it is a tremendous example of architecture from the time, or the Germans bombed it in 1941. Wren seems to, I think he rebuilt the majority of those churches. So they all adhere to a fairly consistent style, at least as my untrained architectural eye can observe.
And is that, following on from that, is it also partly the gradual decline in the need for churches, which was specific to, for instance, the houses that were demolished and Henry VIII, the abbeys and priories that were no longer being used, that churches were then inherited as parish churches. So you have an intensity of church buildings in a city like London. And if you look at Norwich, for instance, Norwich, I don't think Norwich has ever had a catastrophic fire. But Norwich, in the centre of Norwich, is a huge number of churches. Huge number of churches going back, into the Middle Ages. So it's a change in pattern in that way as well, maybe.
I think so, and I think, in some ways it's an opportunity, it's seen as an opportunity to kind of clean out these ancient holdovers from a time before Henry. I saw a hand back here, I think.
Yeah, I have a question. Why do regular and rectilinear streets, why does that prevent fire? Because obviously, the Great Fire in Chicago, there were rectilinear streets before and after.
Right. Well, and they don't prevent fire. What they do is they make it easier to limit the spread of fire. One of the essential things about this is that the streets also need to be reasonably wide. But it makes for easier fighting the fire in conditions of bad wind. You don't get as many strange wind patterns moving around. It makes it easier to plan your defense against the fire. One of the things that made this fire so terrible is there was a strong wind out of the east for about 3 days that just kept pushing the fire west. Most of the spread is actually westward, and it slowly creeps back towards the tower. If you have a regular pattern, you don't get as strange winds. It also makes it easier to prepare your defense. One of the primary ways of defending against a major fire in this age is through tearing buildings down in the way of the fire. In fact, the Great Fire of London is the first time that gunpowder is used as part of a firefighting effort. So they're blowing up houses to try to stop the spread of the fire. They're not doing it far enough in front of the fire, so they don't have the time to clean out the debris, so you just have a pile of flaming rubble. But it makes it much easier to organize a fire defense.
Why didn't that work in Chicago?
What's that?
Why didn't that work in Chicago?
Chicago was, well, ultimately, none of these make for a fireproof city. It makes for a more effective firefighting system. Chicago was in a perilous situation regardless. First of all, it was built very, very fast. It was made almost primarily of wood, including with wooden sidewalks, in October of 1781 when it caught fire. It was at I think at the tail end of a very long drought. It was also in the middle of a terrific weather pattern that made for very hot, dry, and windy conditions. And interestingly, on the same day that the Great Chicago Fire breaks out, there are two other major fires in the Midwest that don't get any press because Chicago burned up that day. There was a fire in northern Michigan, an enormous forest fire, and of course the biggest fire that is ever, the worst forest fire that has ever happened in the United States also took place that day in northern Wisconsin, what's known as the Great Peshtigo Fire. It burned up 2,500 square miles, did more damage to property, and killed vastly more people than the Chicago Fire. And the confluence of those three fires has largely been attributed to a horrific weather pattern that was going on. So Chicago might have been an easier environment in which to fight fire, but any major wind-driven fire is going to have the upper hand. And I'm happy to keep going, but I also don't want to trap the people who want to get anywhere else. But I'm happy to answer more questions afterwards. Thank you.